Okay, our next speaker is Peter Stacey. Peter is Associate Professor of History at UCLA. He's the author of a book called Roman Monarchy and the Renaissance Prince, published by CUP, 2007. And his current research is on Machiavelli's political philosophy and theory of the state and political ontology, about which he is going to speak now. Peter.
Thank you very much indeed. So I want to talk today in fairly general terms about the conceptual crux of Machiavelli's political philosophy, which is his theory of the state. And many of you have been exploring the distinctive architecture of that theory in your work, and all of you, I take it, are highly familiar with its basic elements. So I'm going to try and move fairly quickly down to a level in the theory in which I think matters become a little less obvious. And I want to do just two things today. I mean, the first is simply to outline the theory, but to do so by placing it under a kind of historical description which draws attention to its explanatory power. And that involves placing it in its intellectual and ideological context. And here I'm mainly going to be talking about Machiavelli's systematic working in the discorsi of the classical picture of the free state which he inherits, though I am going to be talking periodically about Il Principe as well. And it seems to me that one benefit of bringing a bit more historical definition to this specific movement of thought is that we begin to see exactly what Machiavelli is evacuating from that classical picture. Machiavelli is constantly hollowing out classical concepts and recharacterizing them. But it does help, I think, to inspect a little bit more closely what precise metaphysical assumptions he's busy stripping away. And one way in which it helps is that it reveals a specific characteristic of Machiavelli's theory, which is not, I think, still sufficiently emphasized, and that is the degree to which it envisages citizenship as an intensely artificial construction. So we tend to identify this degree of artifice with the accounts of political personality associated later in early modern theories of the state, most obviously Hobbes and Rousseau. Well, Machiavelli's writing in a completely different idiom, of course, but he's also deeply concerned to underline the extent to which we can and indeed must rely upon the transformative effects of the apparatuses of the state upon persons living within it if we want to achieve our goals in politics. And that is precisely, as I see it, why Lo Stato comes to do so much philosophical work. Well, my second aim is to draw attention to just one aspect of the design of Lo Stato Libero in Machiavelli, and this particular feature arises as a response to a recurrent historical problem which has a particular urgency for Machiavelli as he writes, and that problem, as he puts it, is that very often, molte volte, il popolo ingannato di una falsa immagine di bene desidera la rovina sua. So, very often il popolo desires its own ruin, deceived by a false image of the good. Now, historically, of course, that question of political suicide is focused on a consideration of how, in Machiavelli's words, Caesar could so blind the multitude that it did not recognize the yoke it was putting on its own neck. So since the 1370s, of course, civic humanists in Florence had been alleging, in profoundly Ciceronian terms, that Caesar had enslaved the Roman Republic and that to live under a prince was to live in a state of servitude. But the question of how exactly one person places and maintains vast groups of people in a state of unfreedom leads Machiavelli into new territory in Il Principe and the Discorsi. Now, I just want to make clear, Machiavelli is not alone in believing that people collaborate in their own servitude. You see that much in Alemanno Rinuccini's excoriating attack on the Medicean domination of Florentine politics in De Libertate in 1479, and in Guicciardini's dialogue on the government of Florence later in the 1520s, we find the claim, it is difficult, indeed it is almost impossible, for a private citizen to reduce a free city to slavery without having the support of some of the citizens themselves. But only, it seems to me, does Machiavelli alone possess the intellectual ambition to be able to embody this insight into his account of the state, and he does so by attacking the pivotal role conventionally occupied by a very specific idea of political representation in Renaissance Florence. So I want to conclude by saying something very briefly about that issue to point to a connection between the ontology of the state and Machiavelli's thoughts about ideology. So let me begin by drawing the grandiosity from the terms in my title. Machiavelli's no metaphysician, of course, but virtually all political theorists are obliged to give what Philip Pettit's defined as an account of the relationships and structure in virtue of which individuals in a polity constitute a nation, a people, a state. Machiavelli's no exception to this general rule. Throughout his political theory, he furnishes us with a highly idiosyncratic account of the way in which individual and social bodies lock together to produce political associations called stati. Stati are the dominant organizing item in Machiavelli's conceptual machinery. Stato is the master noun, the nodal point of all the principal lines of thinking in his political philosophy about liberty, about servitude, about empire, about corruption, and so on. So the first and most obvious point of departure for any discussion of his ontology is a question of quality, qualis est, what kind of things are these states? So Machiavelli says states are lots of things, actually, and he thinks about them in various different ways, but the dominant conceptualization, as we saw abundantly clearly yesterday, is that of a body. So we're introduced to that thought by Machiavelli in his definition of states, chapter 1 of The Prince, and thenceforth the account gathers increasing complexity. By the end of chapter 3, the allegory of the state is well underway. By the close of the text, the body's acquired not just humours and appetites, but nerves and even needs. So in the Discorsi, we see three developments of this account at the start of each of the three books. So book 1's opening chapter speaks of the birth of Rome. Chapter 11, Rome is called the daughter of Romulus, to whom she is said to owe her birth and her education. And that language of parenthood and nurture seems crucial to Machiavelli's theory, because it helps him explain the benevolence involved in this initial relationship of domination. It mitigates its effects considerably. So the state's outstandingly creative founding father keeps his fledgling creation free from external military threats, while his legislative acts create political structures which shape the emergence of il vivere libero, young state being ordered to conform to behaviors which help it develop its liberty, if not quite the flourishing, fully flourishing, free of way of life, which justifies the title of Repubblica. So the generation of the free state is not spontaneous, it's an historically staggered process. Well, in Book 2, a second refinement is a much closer attention to the relationship between the body of the state and the body of those over whom it extends its rule. So here, the processes of acquistare, ampliare, fare imperio, at the heart of Machiavelli's theory of empire, are couched in the language of incorporation. So chapter 2 states that the aim of a republic is to deprive all other bodies of their vitality and to weaken them in order to increase its own body. So accrescere, ingrossare il corpo della città. So the image is one of a much larger, demanding body, sapping the strength of those under its command. And then in Book 3, as we well know, we have the description at the very beginning of the state's proneness to corruption as a type of degenerative disease in the body requiring periodic intervention. So the theory of the free state is articulated as an extended life cycle, which talks of the state's parentage, its birth, its growth, its expansion, and its subsequent decline in health or its renewal through intervention. And here you might say, of course, Machiavelli's merely developing the classical metaphor of his sources in typical Renaissance style. After all, Machiavelli's staring at Livy's account of the generation and growth of what the Roman historian calls the civitas libera. Machiavelli even cites Livy's use of that distinctively Ciceronian term. And Livy's account of the Roman free state is in turn couched as a description of what Cicero called in the De Officiis the corpus Republicae. So that corpus is firmly established in Book 1 of Livy's account, Romulus imposing legislation on the Romans, since nothing else but law could unite them into a body politic. If we turn to Sallust, we find the opening of his massively influential account, the growth and subsequent degradation of the Roman res publica in the Catiline, underpinned by exactly the same image. So it's certainly the case that Machiavelli wants to monopolize that classical image in his theory of the state. But his description of the body is riveted to an entirely novel, highly controversial political ontology. And it's also the point at which I think we see the theoretical machinery which he's put together from classical materials decisively slipping onto a new conceptual grid entirely. And it's that movement of thought that I now want to concentrate on for my remaining time. So the Republican tradition in Florence inherited from its Roman predecessor a series of disagreements about how best to arrange the civitas liber, or free state. But on the definition of libertas itself, it remained as unequivocal as the Roman source which came to inform it from the 200 onwards. Being free meant not being reduced to the status of a slave. So for all the conflicts which characterized Roman politics in their popular and aristocratic forms, the analysis of political libertas remained deeply parasitic upon juridical notions of freedom and servitude, later codified in Roman law. In the Theory of Persons, in Justinian's Digest, the difference between the free person and slave is said to consist in the fact, and I quote, "Some persons are in their own power, some are subject to the law of another. Slaves are persons in the power of their masters, said to be subject to the jurisdiction of someone else." So they're not sui juris, as we still say, but are subject to the jurisdictional power of a master. And in Roman law, slaves are classifiable, as we know, as items of property. They're persons, but they're also things which belong to someone else. They are possessioni. Well, when these conceptions were applied to the body politic, the question for Roman Republican political theory became one of how to ensure that the res publica remains free of masters who threaten to reduce it to its servile status through domination and render it a res privata, a thing owned. And there are, of course, conflicting answers to that problem in Roman political, constitutional, and moral theory. But the problem that's bequeathed from Rome to the Renaissance, in Republican terms, does revolve around concerns about liberty as a kind of status. About this much, I think Philip Pettit and Quentin Skinner are absolutely right. We're looking at a very distinctive conception of political liberty which insists not merely on the absence of arbitrary interference in our lives, because that much masters can give their slaves, but on the structurally assured absence of dominating figures in political life. And it's from that point of departure that flows the constitutionalism that we see in Renaissance republicanism from Bruni to Machiavelli. Their view is that we enjoy the kind of freedom that we're looking for only within a specific type of civil association consisting of robust leggi e ordini, that distinctive bundle of laws, social and political institutions and customs, which Machiavelli regards as the product of successful state formation. So it's the state which guarantees you your free or your unfree status. Now, Machiavelli agrees that popular participation in elections, voting on legislation, are crucial to liberty. These constitutional features, through consent, ensure that each person in the free state can said to be remaining sui juris. They also help to ensure that no one person or group is able to impose their will decisively upon the government of the body politic. So the body politic is free in just the same way as an individual free person governed according to its arbitrium. But a gaping chasm opens up between Machiavelli and his predecessors when he turns to consider the question of collaboration in securing this social and political status. And that question meant searching for some kind of guarantee, of course, that in voting, electing, and governing, we don't act out of partisan concerns, but align our interests with those of our fellow citizens. And the conventional answer to this problem was simply to refer, well, not simply, but generally and always to refer to Cicero's theory of moral obligation in De Officiis. We should cultivate a set of civic virtues, especially justice, making ourselves servants of the common good, fixing our gaze firmly on what is beneficial to the body of the Republic as a whole, not our own advantage. And it's really hard to overstate the seminal effect of De Officiis on Florentine political theory from Latini onwards. You see its doctrines endlessly expounded, almost verbatim, by Bruni, Poggio, Palmieri, particularly Alberti, Sacchi, in their accounts of the formation of the citizen. But for Machiavelli, a Ciceronian theory of citizenship brought with it three utterly unacceptable implications. So first, it brings with it a Stoic conception of natural rationality, natural sociability, natural justice, which comes to anchor Cicero's account of the Roman free state. And Machiavelli simply and repeatedly ridicules all those Stoic claims, which had led Cicero to claim that humans are naturally bound together in bonds of love and benevolence by their shared reason. As Machiavelli makes quite clear in chapter 1 of the Discorsi, men do not meet together and congregate out of natural social impulse, but out of a need for protection against military aggression. And in his conjectural theory of the state, in chapter 2, we're introduced to a moral genealogy, as we've just heard, in which justice originates as the name given to the behavior of the person who protects us against such aggression. So we start with a thoroughly nominalist account of justice and not a natural theory about it riveted in a universalist conception of human rationality. But that same Stoic metaphysics had underpinned Cicero's account of moral personality, which was presented famously in Book 1 of the De Officiis as a dramatic allegory. So we should realize that we are clothed by nature with two personae, two masks, two roles. Cicero concedes that nature gives us an individual identity consisting in a series of natural attributes, but insists that its moral development must always harmonize with that second persona, with what he calls the communal one. And that second persona derives from the fact that we all participate in reason from which is drawn all good and proper conduct, our duty. But Cicero's really exercised in this account by the problem of a moral personality deformed by cupiditas principatus, the libidinal desire for preeminence embodied in the person of Caesar. And that monarchical desire he presents as an irrationalism which is offensive to natural justice. So famously to kingship belongs neither sacred fellowship nor faith. And his solution to its occurrence in political life is to advocate a neo-Stoic model of rational self-mastery for the citizen. So that part of the story gets heavily accentuated in the Quattrocento, partly under the influence of Platonism. And thirdly, Cicero's analysis is famously accompanied by a specific idea of representation. So the De Officiis famously urges us to leave aside our partisan concerns and assume the persona civitatis, so the person of a civitas when we're elected as governors. So Cicero's here treating the civitas as one person whose likeness can be simulated by a single mask. Okay, and underlying that image is a picture of a unified body organized in alignment with reason and nature. And that doctrine is reiterated continually from the Duecento in the relevant literature. We find Matteo Palmieri rehearsing the relevant Ciceronian passage virtually word for word in Della Vita Civile. When we act as civil magistrates, we must strip ourselves of our own persona, he says, and embody the public persona of the civil body. So the picture bequeathed by this ideology, the architecture, is that of a direct, one-to-one, symmetrical relationship between the free person and the free body politic. The latter configured as the former writ large, the corporal analogy purporting a vision of communal self-government. And it's that vision that's decisively rejected by Machiavelli. And the problem for Machiavelli is not just the metaphysics, it's the politics. So Cicero's De Officiis had hardly succeeded in averting Caesarism, neither had the reiteration of its message in Renaissance Florence. So Machiavelli's intervention consists in dramatically rethinking the problem of the libido dominandi. And the problem with keeping on putting that problem outside the state, both in theory and in practice, is that it just keeps coming back at you, whether you send it into exile physically or psychically. And Machiavelli certainly has no confidence in all the prevalent piety surrounding the civic ethic of self-mastery. It's a very revealing fact about Machiavelli's lexicon that the only self-reflexive verb which does any work in it at all is ingannarsi. So for Machiavelli, the single thing that people can be relied to do to themselves with any regularity is to engage in quite baroque acts of self-deception. They also deceive others, of course, and that's what makes it hard for Machiavelli to find a role in his theory for the traditional idea of representation. But those problems arise also because he's replaced the conventional picture of the body politic with something extraordinarily difficult to represent. Well, the image that Machiavelli gives us of lo Stato is very familiar to you. His theory works with a very minimal set of ontological assumptions about human beings as desiring bodies in a world reanimated by contingency. Note, Machiavelli never lays out a formal ontology of the mind. There's no faculty psychology or theory of the passions even, or even a proper typology of them. He's also highly promiscuous in his terminology. He frequently moves interchangeably between passioni, desideri, umori, appetiti, to denote various mental states which are also extremely rich in cognitive content. It's a very stripped back story, deliberately so, I think. Machiavelli actually wants to leave us alone in many respects. It's true, of course, that some readers can't bear that fact about not being told what their souls look like, and they go off and try and fill in the picture. But that, I think, is to mistake a virtue for a vice. The measure of Machiavelli's philosophical brilliance actually, I think, lies in his massive flair for conceptual economy. And therein, in fact, lies its power, it seems to me, and arguably also its beauty. Anyway, he tells us we're intensely vulnerable creatures, fundamentally animated, as we know, by passions that are unchanging in history. We know the relevant places, so I'm not going to cite them. But he also regards human desire as insatiable. So nature's made men able to crave everything, but unable to attain everything. Men's desires always outstrip their ability to acquire. And that makes it highly destabilizing as a force in political life. Whenever men cease fighting through necessity, we're told in the Discorsi, they go to fighting through ambition, so powerful in human breasts that whenever, whatever high rank men climb to, never does ambition abandon them. So the principal characteristic of vaunting ambition, we might say with Shakespeare, is that it leaps itself. So Machiavelli also thinks of ambition as impairing the cognitive capacities of agents to be able to grasp the full picture of what's going on around them. Ambition is blinding. But that general assertion about the limitless character of ambitious desire is embedded in a much more complicated, historically inflected account of the content of those desires, which are, of course, defined by the political history of states. Men's fortunes vary, Machiavelli says, because since some men desire to get more, others fear to lose what they've already acquired. They indulge in enmity and war. And that vision of two fundamentally conflicting blocks of desiring bodies is the basic tenet of the social ontology, which we find first laid out in chapter 9 of Il Principe. There you know the story, two different humours, two social groups, locked in endemic conflict, and as you well know too, the same view laid out far more elaborately in chapters 4 and 5 of book 1 of the Discorsi. And that social conflict in turn yields the political ontology. It has three possible outcomes: o principato, o libertà, o licenzia. So the play of contrary forces can be manipulated by a political agent into producing either a principality or a republic, or else it can be failed to be disciplined at all by any state structure. But in any state, there will always remain those two implacably opposed, ineradicable, desiring features. And the concept of lo Stato is designed to incorporate both those humours. And that incorporation produces a radical asymmetry between the individual person and the state. So Machiavelli erases the fundamental principle of identity between his citizens, replacing it with this irreducible element of difference between two types. And as a consequence, lo Stato cannot correspond to any single unified type of naturally recurring body. It's a very peculiar entity, as we know, which Machiavelli comes to call a corpo misto, a mixed body. And Machiavelli stresses the principal characteristic of that mixed stuff of lo Stato throughout his work. It's structured by two desires, two impulses, and attending to those two impulses is the key to state maintenance, and thereby, of course, our freedom or our unfreedom. Good. So those are the elements we know so well. What about the art? What about the artifice? So Machiavelli, as we know, also repeatedly resorts to the binomial pair materia and forma to describe the process of state formation. This terminology allows him, as we also know, to talk about the shape or form as well as the stuff of the state. Now, one common assumption is that terminology indicates reliance upon Aristotelian hylomorphism. In the Anglophone historiography, that view is traced usually to John Pocock's The Machiavellian Moment. It's much more widespread in other European historiographies, but that, I think, is demonstrably wrong. So Machiavelli's drawing on a very different set, I think, of classical resources here. In Roman aesthetic theory, particularly for Vitruvius, the terms materia and forma are deployed in a theoretical landscape detached from any of Aristotle's underlying philosophical commitments. And here the concern is to develop the imagery of the art and artist, which had lain at the heart, of course, of Aristotle's own account. And in Roman rhetorical theory, the pair of terms routinely used to describe the subject matter of speech and the need to shape it artfully. So you need decent raw materials, but then you need to knock it into shape. And of course, the image of the body is absolutely fundamental to both those aesthetic vocabularies, as the Florentine Renaissance well knew. So Machiavelli's drawing, I think, on both of these languages to describe the art of ordering the bodily material of the state. So, to go back to the ontological question, states are spatio-temporal clumps of bodies, of course, possessed of naturally recurring properties, but those properties are deeply unstable, and considerable human artifice, l'arte dello Stato, is required to maintain them. So one effect of whipping out the metaphysics from the picture is that Machiavelli becomes extremely preoccupied in the discorsi with the deeply historical character of beliefs about freedom and servitude. There's now absolutely nothing natural about our ability to reason our way in and out of those political states at all, and hence his concern with the state's role in the creation of those beliefs. Well, that Machiavelli had been grappling with ways of adequately characterizing conditions of liberty and servitude is evident all over Il Principe, indeed from chapter 1. Here he tells us that newly acquired states are either accustomed to living under a prince or used to being free, that statement furnishing the differentia and the principal divisio in Machiavelli's theory of the state. Liberty is the property of a republic, not of a principality. And then during the proof of his case, he expands upon that initial way of casting the distinction. So in chapter 3, of course, new subjects who are formerly under princely rule are said to be non usi a vivere liberi, not used to living free. Those who've previously inhabited republics, contrastingly said, chapter 5, to belong to a city used to living free, usi a vivere liberi. That group of people are accustomed, consueti, to living according to their own laws and in liberty, unlike those who come from city-states and regions used to living under a prince who is said not to know how to live free. So here already you see Machiavelli talking about the states of freedom and unfreedom as a structured situation to which we become accustomed in time as a consequence of membership of one of the two states. But in the Discorsi, he begins to tie this description of freedom and servitude to a much more complex account of state apparatuses and their enduring effect upon the behavior of those inhabiting them, because those ideas simply have to do much more explanatory work now. Machiavelli's tracing the historical life of the state across centuries to show how it culminated in the phenomenon of what he calls Roma serva. And some of his most consolidated thinking about these matters is laid out in chapters 16 to 18 of Book 1. Here, he begins by underlining the great difficulty of people accustomed to living under a prince has later in preserving its liberty if, by any accident, it should gain it. So that is highly unpromising materia. Being accustomed to living under the government of others, not knowing how to reason about matters of public defense and offense, not understanding princes, it returns quickly beneath a yoke that is usually heavier than the one that a little earlier it had thrown off. So people accustomed to il vivere servo, living as slaves, simply don't know what they're missing. I mean, they're very damaged goods. But even in free states, a series of problems begin to recur because of these limited cognitive capacity of citizens to grasp the bigger picture of what the state as a whole needs in order to maintain its liberty. And those problems are characterized by acts of individual and collective misperception, misrepresentation that can become systematic, indeed systemic. And those are the problems, exactly the problems, that is designed for the Free State, is designed to mitigate. It must, in fact, because their effects are completely lethal. That's the point about Caesar. Caesar's only the most dramatic example of Machiavelli's belief that people very often end up desiring their own demise. Well, that propensity for people to propagate false images and to believe in them means that for Machiavelli there are very serious dangers in relying upon people to represent you at any level in the Free State. So Machiavelli's a dramatist, of course. He knows all about rappresentazioni, but his political theory, as we also know, is full of such acts too, actually, yet he seems extremely unwilling to grant representation any role in authorizing agents in government. And one consequence, as you can now, I hope, see, of articulating the body around a principle of conflict is that it becomes extremely hard, in fact impossible, to apply the overall conventional idea of representation anyway. Because how could any individual in such a state embody person morale, the persona civitatis, in the language of the ideology? But Machiavelli, and this is the point that I'm going to leave you on, seems set on undermining the validity of the idea more generally of representation in the structure of government. Because as he sees it, the danger of taking someone to be your authorized representative is in discovering only later that they might just well turn out to be very good actors. So it's certainly the case that the multitude, for example, needs to authorize an agent. It needs a capo, as Machiavelli tells us, chapter 57 of the first book. But that relationship is not one of representation, and you can see why. It's much closer, in fact, to the Roman model, because the civic multitude are never absent from the political decision-making in Rome, nor so in post-94 Machiavellian Republic in Florence. So that seems to me to be important. So to conclude, for Machiavelli, I'm just going to finish on this point of representation. The ability to put oneself forward as a representative in public is, of course, connected to one's ability to engage in successful representational acts. But to place one's trust in those abilities is clearly imprudent. Now, that's not to say, of course, that Machiavelli doesn't counsel the use of representations and misrepresentations. He does so the whole time. The Republic must use them. You see that much in its treatment of its colonial subjects. Book 2 shows us in chapter 4. As for the prince, of course, well, we know the story there. The prince is insistent that he becomes gran simulatore e dissimulatore. So that translation, the famous description of Catiline, dissimulato, accimolato, from the Catiline, another Republican Betois, who threatened, of course, to plunge the Roman people into servitude. So Machiavelli's prince needs to know how, con l'astuzia, aggirare I cervelli degli uomini by performing grande cose. He must know how to act una parte. That's the theatrical language, of course, that's underpinned the account of political representation. But those acts only work, it seems to me, because they find a captive audience, all voluble, all shifting, all eager for gain, eminently capable of mistaking the threat of servitude for the promise of liberty. In Il Principe, none of those characteristics are disciplined into the pursuit of collective goods by the designs of the state. On the contrary, those latter chapters look like such an extravagant parody of the conventional literature because they reveal how, under the pressures of fear, bribery, favoritism, and stupefying spectacle, subjects will routinely fail to cultivate any aspirations for civil freedom, instead settling for partisan or private gain. So they thus collaborate in the reproduction of a wider system of domination, and that is what, by definition, maintaining the state of a principality is. So it's obviously the case there's a much more liberating story in 6, 7, 9, the penultimate and ultimate chapter of The Prince, but I'm inclined to think that its most liberating effect lies in that penetrating account of forms of ideological domination, an account which really is, I want to underline this, an extremely focused and exact act of unmasking. Thank you.
Peter, we have just on 10 minutes or so. So, can I see some questions? Have you got any questions?
Miguel.
I'm going to ask you to kind of try and act on the principle that small is beautiful when it comes to questions.
Okay, Pete, this is a very direct question, right? I don't understand one thing about it. I completely agree that the political ontology of Machiavelli is a corpo misto that's irreducible to the idea of an individual person. Yeah? What I don't understand is why then do you still follow the idea, Quentin Skinner and others, that the important definition of freedom should be based on a private Roman law idea of freedom, which corresponds only to the freedom in individual persons, and ultimately that means owner of your body. You're either owner of your body, so you're sui juris, or someone else owns your body, you're a slave. Clearly, that definition of freedom, right, of ownership of a body, cannot possibly be transposed onto the corpo misto. It cannot. It's just the freedom that corresponds to a corpo misto is not a freedom that is, so to speak, freedom of what is yours and what is mine. There has to be a common, something which is common sense of freedom, or as Aristotelians used to say, a public sense of freedom. And the two are not equivalent. So what I'm saying is that if you do have a different political ontology, then you cannot reduce the important conception of freedom to a private law conception of freedom.
Okay, so two things. One is that the Republic definitely is a corpo misto, and it's definitely lo Stato libero. So how does Machiavelli get there? I take that to be your question. So he gets there, I think, in chapter 1, where you see the Roman law theory of persons picked up and transposed in both its bipartite form and definition of liberty and servitude, not of individual persons, but transposed onto much larger, more complex bodies of the state. Well, that is the complexities, it seems to me, of all the content of the formation of the state apparatus, which is designed to enable each and every one of us at the end of it to remain in a free state or an unfree state, while at the same time never reducing it. It's a very strange picture, I grant you, but never it being a direct one-to-one account of each and every one of us being able to call ourselves free and then being able to have simply one person governing us. So when we look up at the state, we never see the identical person to ourselves. So the connection between the self and the state is fractured. That's completely gone. You're asking about the questions, how in the account is that possibly managed? And I think that is what chapters 1 really to 19 of the first book of the Discourse are about. But we can talk.
Okay, thanks. At the back. You had your hand up?
No.
Yeah? No? Other questions?
I can go on.
Would you accept to synthesize the issue at stake as a difference between the coupling of democracy with sameness and democracy with difference?
Yes, I would. And I think we could go on forever on that, well, not forever, but for a very long and useful time, and we should do that, as to why I think that that's exactly what Machiavelli is trying to do. And I think he succeeds. I happen also to think that this particular account doesn't actually go anywhere historically. I think it gets, parts of it obviously do, but the complexities of it get shunted down into an historical siding. They don't, I mean, that's the part of the genealogy that needs mapping out most closely. It's very, very hard on all sorts of levels to pick up this account and run with it in all its complexity. I mean, there are obviously radical Republicans who want to use parts of it, mainly even the majority of it. But the question that you're making, I think it makes it still a very interesting conceptual configuration for us today. Yeah.
Great paper, thank you. I just have a quick question about the emphasis you play on the body and the organic metaphor, which obviously is essential, but another metaphor which you did not talk about is one of foundation, the architectural metaphors. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, given the corpo misto and the significance of that, where would that fit in your political ontology you developed?
That's an excellent question. So the first thing to say, of course, is that Book 1, Chapter 1 of the Discorsi cites Vitruvius. So the account, I mean, they're two completely interlaced languages, but again, Machiavelli will move in his account of the aesthetics of the state from talking about adorning, which is, of course, a rhetorical language to do with texts, to building foundations and laying. But I think that the coherence is secured by the fact that both the aesthetic visions are of those of how to order and strengthen, of course, the body of tools. There's also the idea of gardening, actually, and cultivation of plants, and all sorts of different... So I don't think it's just the body that's there, but I think that if you come through those other lines, there's a painting metaphor, clearly. I mean, we talked about that yesterday too, but again, if you go back to the Albertian texts, look at what emerges from underneath it that gives it a fundamental unity, and it is an idea of the body. It's just that Machiavelli has a completely weird idea of what that body looks like. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I didn't talk about the architectural stuff at all.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was very, very well done. But a question about how do you reconcile the account of Caesar you give, where Machiavelli blames, quote-unquote, the Roman people for not realizing the yoke they're putting on themselves, with the account in 137, where basically the Roman Senate is creating conditions under which somebody like Caesar is going to rise, so that it's growing economic inequality from the empire that we find out in 137 is causing the disproportionate amount of power that individuals have that he mentioned in 116 that's corrupting the legislative process, the making of laws. So how do we reconcile the blame for Caesarism on the Roman people with the kind of his description of the action in the history places the blame for Caesar's rise with the Senate?
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing to say is I don't think we're in the blame game. I think we're in the game of explanation, and that explanation is extremely complicated for Machiavelli because it's not just about the degeneration of institutions, it's also about a certain amount of moral corruption that enters. So you can't give an account of one without the other. It's just a partial element of this idea of people obviously being led by their excessive ambition for liberty to place their trust in the hands of someone who purports to be a representative, and then, as we see in the case of Appius, completely disintegrates morally into and is reduced actually to their real selves, if you want to call it that. So I don't think that really it's a question of blame. I don't think that's what Machiavelli is getting at. And then I also think that it's just part of a much more complicated story, a story that needs to be complicated because, as Pocock's actually showing in the most recent work on the decline thesis in Machiavelli, the type of explanation, particularly the Sallustian account, and Gabriele is absolutely right, that's the account that Machiavelli is attacking. It's philosophically primitive, but it's also historically primitive, because it's either moral or constitutional or institutional, but it has to be both for Machiavelli. So you get this very historically specific set of moments where, of course, corruption's reversible, and then, of course, when it's not. And I think those are the accumulation of problems in the body as time goes on that are never properly addressed, but it's a piecemeal picture that forms a coherent whole that leads to... I don't think it's just the popolo, or just the grandi, or just the institutions, or just this, that, or the extension of empire. I mean, that's the Sallustian explanation. I think it's a much more complex picture in Machiavelli's hands, precisely because he's not convinced by the account, either from the classical historians or indeed from his own contemporaries, who simply reiterate a lot of that material.
Okay. Peter, thank you. That was very stimulating. I was wondering, how would you relate Machiavelli's break or challenge to the traditional conception of the metaphor of the body politic to the changing conception of the body, the physical body, its physiognomy at the time, from a more static conception of organs and the functionality of the organs to a much more dynamic and fluid understanding of the humors and its dispositions and their potential conflict, etc. So it seems to me that this would be really supportive of your account, but I wondered if you would be willing to go there.
Okay, so I have two brief things to say about that. One is that the complexity of the body politic image in the classical sources reaches a kind of Baroque level, not in the Republican sources, but in Seneca's De Clementia, where you suddenly find the body having hands, feet, skin, all sorts of stuff. That account is picked up in the 12th century by John of Salisbury. You find it in the Polycraticus, you find it in Gerald of Wales, and the 12th century material goes into the 13th century. You find it all over the Neapolitan juridical material, and it comes out in Baudin, that specific Senecan image. It's all over royal ideology in Western Europe. So that's the stuff. Now, of course, that's expanded. I think your question's getting at to what extent Machiavelli's under the influence of, say, early modern theories. Are you thinking of Galen? I wonder about physiological accounts of the humors. There seems to be one slightly fatal objection to thinking that he's leaning on those accounts in 1513 or 1512 or whatever, and that is because Machiavelli's text of the Prince is deeply engaged with Palmieri's Della Vita Civile, where you find that language in the 1430s of humors used in the Italian. And I don't often find myself saying this about Bauzzi, but he did write an extremely convincing article showing a series of textual relations between Palmieri and Machiavelli, and that's one of them. So I think one has to be careful before jumping into bed with the Galenic story, because there's a lot out there. The other reason is, of course, if you just think about Galen's physiology, all the cognitive content of the humors, which is really what Machiavelli wants to get at, is not there. That's the point of the account, it seems to me.
Ask the permission to do some advertisement for French scholarship. My excellent student Marie Guy, in her dissertation now published. I say a little advertisement for French scholarship. My excellent ex-student Marie Guy, in her dissertation now published in French by Champion, has a whole chapter on Machiavelli's relationship to the Hippocratic tradition, which I believe is not bad, to say the least.
Okay, thank you very much for that.